Hey, it's Brett, and this is Brett and Some Books. And this is going to be one video with two, or probably not three, but maybe, separate articles all on the topic of outside agitators and badjacketing. The Making of Outside Agitators, published by Crimethinc, the anarchist collective. On August 19th, 10 days after police murdered Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, a slew of corporate media stories appeared charging that criminals and outside agitators were responsible for clashes during the protests. CNN alleged that, quote, all sides agree that there are a select number of people, distinct from the majority of protesters, who are fomenting violence, end quote, quoting a state highway patrol captain, a state senator, and a former FBI assistant director to confirm this. Today's militarized police understand that they are operating on two different battlefields at once, not only the battlefield of the streets, but also the battlefield of discourse. So long as most people remain passive, the police can harass, beat, arrest, and even kill people with impunity. Certain people, anyway. But sometimes protests get out of hand, which is to say, they actually impact the authorities' ability to keep the population under control. Then, without fail, police and politicians proceed to the second strategy in their playbook. They declare that they support the protesters and are there to defend their rights, but a few bad apples are spoiling the bunch. In this new narrative, the enemies of the protesters are not the police who are gassing and shooting people, but those who resist the police and their violence. When this strategy works, it enables the police to go back to harassing, beating, arresting, and killing people with impunity. Certain people, anyway. Sure enough, a few hours after these articles about, quote, criminals and, quote, outside agitators appeared, that St. Louis police killed another man less than 3 miles from Ferguson. Here we see how defining people as criminals and outsiders is itself an act of violence, setting the stage for further violence. You can predict police behavior at protests with a fair degree of accuracy based on the rhetoric they deploy in advance to prepare the terrain. So when we hear them say outside agitators, we know the authorities are getting ready to spill blood. All the better, from their perspective, if people buy into this rhetoric and police themselves so no officer has to get his hands dirty. This is often called for in the name of avoiding violence, but self policing returns us to the same passivity that enables police violence to occur in the first place. How many people would have even heard about Michael Brown if not for the quote criminals and agitators who brought his death to our attention? Self policing also preserves the impression that we all choose the state of affairs of our own free will, reinforcing the impression that anyone who does not is an outsider. What is an outside agitator anyway? Deploying the National Guard to a town of 21,000 people, isn't that outside agitation? When Occupy Oakland was in the news in 2011, there was a lot of rhetoric about outside agitators coming to the city to start trouble with police until it came to light that over 90% of Oakland cops live outside of Oakland. Surely, if anyone deserves to be labeled outside agitators in Ferguson, Oakland, or many other communities around the United States, it is the authorities. But what about people who come from out of town to participate in protests? The CNN article claimed that, quote, among those arrested are residents of Chicago, Brooklyn, Washington, San Francisco, Austin, Des Moines, and Huntsville, Alabama, according to jail records, end quote. This might sound like convincing evidence to middle class readers, but anyone who has been poor and precarious knows that the permanent address you give when you are arrested may not be the same place you actually live. You might give a different address because you aren't sure your current housing will last, because the landlord doesn't know your place has more people in it than are named on the lease, or simply because you don't want local vigilantes to know where you live, where to find you. Instead, you might give a more reliable long-term address, perhaps from another state. Still, let's imagine that some of these arrestees who gave out-of-town addresses are in Ferguson for the very first time. Wouldn't that make them outside agitators? Perhaps it would, if the issue was specific to Ferguson alone and they had no stake in it. But in Chicago, Brooklyn, Washington, San Francisco, Austin, Des Moines, and Huntsville, Alabama, as quoted, the police have killed black men under identical circumstances. Militarization, brutality, and systemic racism of the police are in effect all around the country, not just in Ferguson. When people are suffering the same forms of oppression everywhere, it makes sense for us to come to each other's assistance to make common cause. This is not outside agitation, it is solidarity. So long as we understand the problems we face as individualistically, we will be powerless against them. Solidarity has always been the most important tool of the oppressed. This is why the authorities go to such lengths to demonize anyone who has the courage to take risks to support others. Throughout civil rights struggles in the 20th century, participants who are celebrated as heroes today were tarred as outside agitators. The term has a long history on the tongues of racists and reactionaries. In this light, it is ironic, if not unexpected, that one of the corporate media stereotypes of the outside agitator is the quote, white anarchist, as if all anarchists were white. It's no longer considered decorous to call people race traitors, so the allegation is inverted. White people who fight along black and brown people must not have their best interest at heart, certainly not as much as the police and corporate media do. Although declaring oneself an anarchist does not magically free a white person of the racism that pervades our society, it is racist indeed to attribute all the unrest in Ferguson to white anarchists, denying the existence or agency of black and brown participants. This is the corporate media attempting to play a race card of its own in order to create divisions between those who struggle against police brutality. It's not surprising that the authorities would seek to create discord along racial lines. One of the chief reasons race was invented to divide those who would otherwise have a common interest in overturning hierarchy. To emphasize this once more, we have to understand the deployment of rhetoric about outside agitators as a military operation intended to isolate and target an enemy, divide and conquer. The enemy that the authorities are aiming at is predominantly black and brown, but it is not just a specific social body, it is also an aspect of our humanity, a part of all of us. The ultimate goal of the police is not so much to brutalize and pacify specific individuals as it is to extract rebelliousness itself from the social fabric. They seek to externalize agitation, so anyone who stands up for herself will be seen as an outsider, as deviant and antisocial. This would be more likely to succeed if most people were integrated into comfortable places in their power structure, but the problem with their strategy at this particular historical juncture is that more and more of us are finding ourselves outside a steady workplace, outside a recognized position of political legitimacy, outside the incentives that reward people for keeping quiet. We are finding ourselves outside, and in finding each other, we are finding that it doesn't make sense to go on being docile, that our only hope is to stake everything on fighting together for our collective survival rather than contending amongst ourselves for a place in the hierarchy. Next time, the authorities will be lucky if the disturbances are confined to a single town, so they can accuse those who go there of being outside agitators. The racism and police brutality for which Ferguson is now infamous are widespread. This conflagration could spread everywhere, like Occupy did. Stop killing us, or else. And this is the second article we're reading. No badjacketing. The state wants to kill us. Let's not cooperate, by the Twin Cities General Defense Committee, published in 2015. We prepared this short piece after several comrades were badjacketed in public and with pictures on social media at the 4th Precinct shutdown. We believe those individual cases have been dealt with and don't wish to cause unnecessary division by complaining or publicly calling any group or individual out. Instead, this is intended to provoke reflection and conversation among all of us as to how to deal with the suspicions we may have of people we don't know in our growing movements, without creating the sorts of divisions among ourselves that does the work of the state and police for them. We intend to act in solidarity with those who know how to act in solidarity. We ask that all organizations and groups working for a better world in which we have killed white supremacy, capitalism, and other forms of oppression to consider that 1. None of us represent the mandate of all people. 2. That we may have instead genuine and important strategic and tactical differences between ourselves about the best ways to accomplish that world. And 3. That we will not win by pretending these differences do not exist or dictating against difference, but instead by engaging on these differences in the most democratic and least hierarchical ways possible. Therefore, we ask that groups and individuals read this document against the practice of badjacketing, discuss it, and consider publicly endorsing here that we will refrain from the practices of badjacketing. This is not a call to be lax about security. Indeed, many of us have been very involved in the provision of security at the 4th Precinct. Instead, it is a call to be democratic and accountable about our security practices. Every time people organize for liberation, autonomy, and a better world, the state and the bosses try to crush our movements. They don't particularly care how they do it, but they don't want to work hard. It is easier for them if we do it for them. They can do this by misportraying us in the media, and they do. They do this by sowing distrust and division within or between movements, and they do. They can do this by harassing our people and preventing them from getting jobs or demoralizing them with constant police contact, and they do. They do this by sending infiltrators into our groups, and they do. They do this by encouraging fascist groups to attack us, and they do. They do this by directly and opposing and openly attacking us with police, and they do. But perhaps the easiest and most effective thing they can do is to neutralize and destroy our movements for liberation, to encourage us to act paranoid and to refuse each other's solidarity. One of the most effective techniques for this is called jacketing, aka snitch jacketing, badjacketing, or bad rapping. And that's when one of our own, or a paid infiltrator, accuses others without cause or evidence of being an infiltrator, threat, or security risk. Badjacketing is defined as creating suspicion by spreading rumors or unsubstantiated accusations that people are undercovers, infiltrators, snitches, or cooperators. Sometimes this is done out of fear and paranoia, but normally those who lay jackets on others want to consolidate their control over a movement and feel threatened in their authority. It's a favorite tactic of the state in destroying movements of liberation. These tactics of the state and police go together, and jacketing often leads to direct violence and the destruction of movements. If you're still reading, let's take a look at 2 well-known regional cases: the state assassination of Illinois Black Panther Party chairman Fred Hampton and Mike Clark in '69, and the murder of American Indian Movement militant Anna Mae Aquash in 1975. Case 1, infiltrators, jacketing, and assassination. The assassination of Black Panthers Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. The Black Panther Party's Illinois chapter was led by a stellar young militant, Fred Hampton. Their major projects included the self-defense and community support programs, for which the Panthers became justifiably famous. A major next step was to ally with the Blackstone Rangers, an alliance that terrified the Chicago police and politicians and the FBI alike. The FBI dealt with it easily by turning a Panther into an infiltrator. William O'Neill turned snitch in exchange for a first for bail money and uh, in exchange at first for bail money and then increasingly for a great deal of money. O'Neill rose to trusted positions within the BPP, became Hampton's head of security. It was O'Neill who drugged Hampton's food in preparation for the assassination. O'Neill routinely consolidated his power within the BPP by accusing others of being snitches, informants, or state cooperators, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust within the BPP. It was partly his use of jacketing accusations that led to his rise in leadership. O'Neill also played a creating division between the BPP and other groups, most notably the Blackstone Rangers, on behalf of the FBI. In addition to talking shit about the Rangers with his BPP comrades, O'Neill composed forged letters between the Rangers and the BPP, insulting and threatening each other. O'Neill was successful in this regard. The two groups never achieved strategic or tactical cooperation. The infiltration of movements and movement spaces is real and dangerous, as the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark demonstrate. But jacketing is another tool used to destroy movements and is used most frequently by infiltrators themselves. One, at the least, it pushes away people who have or are willing to do the work and make sacrifices for the movements. Two, worse, it silences entire groups by sowing mistrust within them and making discussions of strategy and tactics difficult. Three, very commonly, those accused of acting as informants become so alienated from their accusers that they actually become snitches. And four, worst case scenario, people die. That worst case scenario is all too common and real, and there is famous regional history to it as well. In the case of Anna Mae Aquash, a Native American woman from Canada who had worked and sacrificed tirelessly for the American Indian Movement, or AIM. Case 2, Infiltrators, Jacketing, and Murder, the murder of Anna Mae Aquash from the American Indian Movement. In February 1976, the body of Anna Mae Aquash was found exposed in South Dakota. She'd been shot in the head execution style, apparently because someone thought she was an infiltrator. In what should have been a pattern at this point, there was indeed an infiltrator within AIM, but it wasn't Anna Mae. Instead, it was an infiltrator named Douglas Durham, a white man claiming Native heritage, who had gained the trust of key AIM members. As with O'Neill, it was partly through lying about others, jacketing, that he gained his position of leadership and trust within AIM. Durham accused Anna Mae of working for the feds. Anna Mae ended up murdered. There remains a lot of controversy and anger over who killed her. No serious person believes she was a Fed. Very few believe the Feds killed her, but they might as well have done so, given the violence and repression they were inflicting on AIM, as they had done with the BPP. It was natural that people within AIM would be suspicious and armed for self-defense. By creating more suspicion and paying Douglas Durham to accuse Anna Mae, the FBI is directly involved in the murder of Anna Mae Aquash. But whoever pulled the trigger on her allowed themselves to become accomplices of the state and enemies of Native people, First Nations. AIM lost one of its most dedicated and skilled organizers, and the blame for her murder remains a source of division within the movement. After being attacked by the police, dismissed and lied about the media, shot at by white supremacists, and insulted by many in the public, It is natural to be on edge and find it difficult to work together or to trust those we don't already know and trust. This is why racism and sexism and oppression of all sorts exist, to divide groups from each other in order to more effectively take advantage of them. We will win when our solidarity trespasses the boundaries they set for us. Against all oppression, we stand for the solidarity of the people, the Twin Cities GDC, Local 14. And this third article is actually an open letter titled Concerning the Violent Peace Police, an open letter to Chris Hedges by David Graeber, published 2012. I'm writing this on the premise that you are a well-meaning person who wishes Occupy Wall Street to succeed. I am also writing this as someone who was deeply involved in the early stages of planning Occupy in New York. I am also an anarchist who has participated in many black blocs. While I have never personally engaged in acts of property destruction, I have on more than one occasion taken part in blocs where property damage has occurred. I have taken part in even more blocs that did not engage in such tactics. It's a common fallacy that this is what black blocs are all about. It isn't. I was hardly the only black bloc veteran who took part in planning the initial strategy for Occupy Wall Street. In fact, anarchists like myself were the real core of the group that came up with the idea for occupying Zuccotti Park, the 99% slogan, the General Assembly process, and, in fact, who collectively decided that we would adopt a strategy of Gandhian nonviolence and eschew acts of property damage. Many of us had taken part in black blocs. We just didn't feel that was an appropriate tactic for the situation we were in. This is why I feel compelled to respond to your statement, The Cancer in Occupy. This statement is not only factually inaccurate, it is quite literally dangerous. This is the sort of misinformation that really can get people killed. In fact, it is far more likely to do so, in my estimation, than anything done by any black-clad teenager throwing rocks. Let me just lay out a few initial facts. 1. Black bloc is a tactic, not a group. It is a tactic where activists don masks and black clothing, originally leather jackets in Germany, later hoodies in America, as a gesture of anonymity, solidarity, and to indicate to others that they are prepared, if the situation calls for it, for militant action. The very nature of the tactic belies the accusation that they are trying to hijack a movement and endanger others. One of the ideas of having a black bloc is that everyone who comes to a protest should know where the people likely to engage in militant action are, and thus easily be able to avoid it if that's what they wish to do. Black blocs do not represent any specific ideological, or for that matter, anti-ideological position. Black blocs have tended in the past to be made up primarily of anarchists, but most common participants whose politics vary from Maoism to social democracy. They are not united by ideology or lack of ideology, but merely a common feeling that creating a bloc of people with explicitly revolutionary politics and ready to confront the forces of order through more militant tactics if required is, on the particular occasion when they assemble, a useful thing to do. It follows one can no more speak of black bloc anarchists as a group with an identifiable ideology as no one can speak of sign-carrying anarchists or mic-checking anarchists. If you must select a tiny ultra-radical minority group within the black bloc and pretend their views are representative of anyone who ever put on a hoodie, you could at least be up to date about it. It was back in '99 that people used to pretend the black bloc was made up of nihilist primitivist followers of John Zerzan, opposed to all forms of organization. Now, the preferred approach is to pretend the black bloc is made up of nihilistic insurrectionary followers of the Invisible Committee, opposed to all forms of organization. Both are absurd slurs. Yours is also 12 years out of date. 4. Your comment about black blockers hating Zapatistas is one of the weirdest I've ever seen. Sure, if you dig around, you can find someone saying almost anything, but I'm guessing that, despite the ideological diversity, if you took a poll of participants in the average black bloc and asked what political movement in the world inspired them the most, the EZLN would get about 80% of the vote. In fact, I'd be willing to wager that at least a third of participants in the average black bloc are wearing or carrying at least one item of Zapatista paraphernalia. Have you ever actually talked to someone who has taken part in a black bloc, or just to people who dislike them? 5. Diversity of tactics is not a black bloc idea. The original General Assembly in Tompkins Square Park that planned the original occupation, if I remember, adopted the principle of diversity of tactics. At least it was discussed in a very approving fashion. At the same time, as we also concurred that a Gandhian approach would be the best way to go. This is not a contradiction. Diversity of tactics means leaving such matters up to individual conscience, rather than imposing a code on anyone. Particularly, this is because imposing such a code invariably backfires. In practice, it means some groups break off in indignation and do even more militant things than they would have otherwise, without coordinating with anyone else, as happened, for instance, in Seattle. The results are usually disastrous. After the fiasco of Seattle, of watching some activists actively turning others over to the police, we quickly decided we needed to ensure this never happened again. What we found is that if we declared we shall all be in solidarity with one another, we will not turn in fellow protesters to the police, we will treat you as brothers and sisters, but we expect you to do the same to us, end quote, then those who might be disposed to more radical militant tactics will act in solidarity as well, either by not engaging in militant actions at all for fear they will endanger others, as in many later global justice actions, where black blocs merely helped protect the lockdowns, or in Zuccotti Park, where mostly people didn't block up at all, or doing things so in a way that run the least risk of engagement of endangering fellow activists. All this is secondary. Mainly, I am writing as an appeal to conscience, your conscience, since clearly you are a sincere and well-meaning person who wishes this movement to succeed. I beg you, please consider what I am saying. Please bear in mind as I say this that I am not a crazy nihilist, but a responsible person who is one, if just one, of the original authors of the Gandhian strategy OWS adopted, as well as a student of social movements who has spent many years both participating in such movements and trying to understand their history and dynamics. I'm appealing to you because I really do believe that this kind of statement you made is profoundly dangerous. The reason I say this is because, whatever your intentions, it is very hard to read your statement as anything but an appeal to violence. After all, what are you basically saying about what you call black bloc anarchists? 1. They are not part of us. 2. They are consciously malevolent in their intentions. 3. They are violent. 4. They cannot be reasoned with. 5. They are all the same. 6. They wish to destroy us. 7. They are a cancer that must be excised. Surely you must recognize, when it's laid out in this fashion, that it is precisely the sort of language and argument that, historically, has been invoked by those encouraging one group of people to physically attack, ethnically cleanse, or exterminate another. In fact, the sort of language and argument that is almost never invoked in any other circumstance. After all, if a group is made up exclusively of violent fanatics who cannot be reasoned with, intent on our destruction, what else can we really do? This is the language of violence in its purest form. Far more than, quote, fuck the police, end quote. We see this kind of language employed by someone who claims to be speaking in the name of nonviolence is genuinely extraordinary. I recognize that you've managed to find certain peculiar fringe elements and anarchism saying some pretty extreme things. It's not hard to do, especially since such people are much easier to find on the internet than in real life, but it would be difficult to come up with any black bloc anarchist making a statement as extreme as this. Even if you did not intend this statement as a call to violence, which I suspect you did not, how can you honestly believe that many will not read it as such? In my experience, when I point this sort of thing out, the first reaction I normally get from pacifists is along the line of, "What are you talking about? Of course I'm not in favor of attacking anyone. I am nonviolent. I am merely calling for nonviolently confronting such elements and excluding them from the group." End quote. The problem is that, in practice, this is almost never what actually happens. Time after time, what has actually meant what it has actually meant in practice is either A, turning fellow activists over to the police, an example, returning them turning them over to people with weapons who will physically assault, shackle, and imprison them, or B, actual physical activist on activist assault. Such things have happened. There have been physical assaults by activists on other activists, and to my knowledge, they have never been perpetrated by anyone in Black Bloc, but invariably by purported pacifists who, against those who dare to pull a hood over their heads or bandana over their faces, or simply against anarchists who adopt tactics someone else thinks are going too far. Not, I should note, even potentially violent tactics. During one 15-minute in Occupy Austin, I was threatened first with arrest, then with assault by fellow campers because I was expressing verbal solidarity with, and then standing in passive resistance beside, a small group of anarchists who were raising what was considered to be an unauthorized tent. This situation often produces extraordinary ironies. In Seattle, the only incidents of actual physical assault by protesters on other individuals were not attacks on the police, since those did not occur at all, but attacks by pacifists on black blockers engaged in acts of property damage. Since the black blockers had collectively agreed on a strict policy of nonviolence, which they defined as never doing anything to harm another living being, they uniformly refused to strike back. In many recent occupations, self-appointed peace police have manhandled activists who showed up to marches in black clothing and hoods, ripped their masks off, shoved and kicked them, always without the victims themselves having engaged in any act of violence, always with the victims refusing, on moral grounds, to shove or kick back. The kind of rhetoric you are engaging in, if it disseminates widely, will ensure this kind of violence becomes much, much more severe. Perhaps you do not believe me, or do not believe these events to be particularly significant. If so, let me put the matter in a larger historical context. If I understand your argument, it seems to come down to this. OWS has been successful because it has followed a Gandhian strategy of showing how, even in the face of strictly nonviolent opposition, the state will respond with illegal violence. 2. Black bloc elements who do not act according to principles of Gandhian strategy, nonviolence are destroying the movement because they provide retroactive justification for state repression, especially in the eyes of the media. 3. Therefore, the black bloc's element must somehow be rooted out. As one of the authors of the original Gandhian strategy, I can recall how well aware we were when we formed this strategy that we were taking an enormous risk. Gandhian strategies have not historically worked in the U.S. In fact, they haven't really worked on a mass scale since the Civil Rights Movement. This is because the U.S. media is simply constitutionally incapable of reporting acts of police repression as violence. One reason the civil rights movement was an exception is so many Americans at the time didn't view the Deep South as part of the same country. Many of the young men and women who formed the famous Black Bloc in Seattle were in fact eco-activists who had been involved in tree sits and forest defense lockdowns that operated on purely Gandhian principles, only to find that in the US of the 1990s, nonviolent protesters could be brutalized, tortured, have pepper spray rubbed directly in their eyes, or even killed without serious objection from the national media, so they turned to other tactics. We all knew this. We decided it was worth the risk. However, we are also aware that when the repression begins, some will break ranks and respond with greater militancy. Even if this doesn't happen in a systemic and organized fashion, some violent acts will take place. You write that black blockers smashed up a locally owned coffee shop. I doubted this when I read it, since most black blocs agree on a strict policy of not damaging owner-operated enterprises. And I find now in Susie Cagle's response to your article that, in fact, it was a chain coffee shop and the property destruction was carried out by someone not in black. But still, you're right, a few such incidents will inevitably occur. The question is how one responds. If the police decide to attack a group of protesters, they will claim to have been provoked, and the media will repeat whatever the police say, no matter how implausible, as the basic initial facts of what happened. This will happen whether or not anyone at the protest does anything that can be remotely described as violence. Many police claims will be obviously ridiculous, as at the recent Oakland march where police accused participants of throwing improvised explosive devices. But no matter how many times the police lie about such matters, the national media will still report their claims as true, and it will be up to protesters to provide evidence to the contrary. And I am running out of time to record this on my phone. So just to wrap up the end, it discusses how the media is going to listen to the police, and even if people are peaceful, the media is not going to emphasize the contradiction in what was expected, or the contrast. And also, Gandhi and his nonviolent movement were regularly denounced in the media, just as nonviolent anarchists are also always denounced in the media. And I might remark here that while not an anarchist himself, Gandhi was strongly influenced by anarchists like Kropotkin and Tolstoy. They were regarded as a mere front for more violent terroristic elements with whom he was said to be secretly collaborating. So even Gandhi wasn't immune from being painted with the same brush. We shouldn't help the police and the legacy media monopolize the narrative. Please subscribe, check out my other videos.